Not only one of the worst films ever made, in my opinion, like down there or up there, however you want to rank it, with Room or those horrible Charlie's Angels movies of the early 2000s, which I took a lot of heat from some person because I thought they were awful. Right down at the bottom or at the top of the worst movies ever, however you want to rank it. This is 1989, Bill Paxton, Mark Hamill, Slipstream. It really says a lot to be one of the worst movies ever made when, especially in the science fiction genre, there's a lot of stuff out there in the era of low-budget productions that, I mean, and there was a time in America where there were 1,000 Westerns a year coming out, and some of those Westerns were just awful. Likewise, science fiction, there's always been this sort of subgenre of B and C and D and Z-list movies. When you've got someone with the name of Mark Hamill attached to the production, feeding off that Star Wars fame, but who infamously cannot act. I'm sorry, he can't. He's great as Luke Skywalker because he is Luke Skywalker. It's what you expect. But even when he's the trickster, it reminded me of Michael Keaton's Beetlejuice, another guy who can't act. It was that dude with some makeup on doing a funny voice. Nothing resembling the ability to actually completely, I mean, not everyone is an Oscar-worthy performer, but the greats like Gary Oldman, Johnny Depp, people that have the ability to become someone you don't even realize per se is them, somewhere in the middle is a really good to great actor. From that fabulousness, Mark Hamill, Michael Keaton, they're down at this level of it. It's hard to discern. A brief clip of them behaving does not give away what film it's in unless they got a specific makeup on or a specific facial hair. They're just themselves. Sorry. But of course, when you're trying to make a big new sci-fi production, and you can read the details of that online, to check out its Wikipedia entry or anywhere else on fandom, they were trying to get something really big started, and you've got a big name like Mark Hamill. You just got to use him correctly. He's got to be more like Luke Skywalker than not, because that's his shtick, and it really fails utterly. Trying to make him something like a human version of the Terminator, you're not going to carry that gravitas. Now, and I often say this with science fiction films, I don't want to pick on it too terribly. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in this. This is why I love the genre of science fiction. There's a lot of really cool stuff in Slipstream, but most of it is sort of barely in the movie or touched upon and left, not pursued. The whole thing ends up thrown up on the screen in a way that is so profoundly boring and uninteresting that it was hard to watch through it without dozing off. It was hard to actually know what was going on and have any expectation of what they were doing and what you were looking forward to, not because they didn't tell you enough, but because they did it in such a horrifically boring way you were daydreaming and you missed it. It's just that bad. On the other hand, there's all these bits and pieces of a world, environmental chaos, post-apocalyptic. The environment has crushed human civilization because of the wind, the slipstream, and it whips around the earth. Somehow or another, they still fly in it, though. Flying kites and balloons seem to be the mode of travel. Clearly, the balloons, though, there's a possibility of getting above it. There's an android civilization that might replace us that is able to live at a high enough elevation because where the balloons aren't affected, which is kind of cool, but not really followed up on. There's a lot of different classes of humanity along the way and how each have survived and what their aspirations are or not for rebuilding human civilization. The weird museum, colony / country club, rich elite folks seem to have a vague idea of rebuilding civilization. People at the diner along the truck highway, which is really the metaphor there, seem to just be eking out a living to survive bit by bit. One has a more practical strategy for long-term survival. The other one has more of a conception of rebuilding human civilization. And like I'm telling this, and it sounds really interesting, but I assure you that it is not. This is the problem. These are really cool ideas that could work, but the way that we're given them don't work. Our Mark Hamill being sort of a ranger that travels the Slipstream, pursuing bad guys who are on the run. There's that sci-fi Western feel, all of that, but doesn't come together right. You could conceivably, if we were living in a time where every reboot wasn't garbage and they weren't constantly destroying stuff, I would say somebody needs to scoop in on this. The web suggests there are rumors that it fell into the public domain because nobody cared. The official streaming version has glitches in the tracking and sound errors because nobody bothered to preserve this thing. I was lucky to find it to watch it. And yet, if you made a movie or an entire series in a post-apocalyptic world with a slipstream that is whipping around the globe at a certain elevation in a certain direction, and what's left of human civilization trying to survive along the stream, battening down the hatches, living in caves, living in deep valleys, with rangers trying to rebuild law and order who travel the wind with a special machine that whips around the earth, that they are constantly, because you can only go one direction if it's a slipstream, that you make the circle and you take the loop and you follow. You could have them meet new people along the way, looking for new colonies of survivors. There'd be a little bit of that otherworld feel, or even Stargate or Star Trek feel of each episode coming to a new place. How have these people survived? What's gone haywire with their version of human culture? How do we begin to rebuild the Earth? You add into that the androids. It's a slightly futuristic Earth that has had this disaster. Are the androids going to be a threat? Is it going to be a Terminator thing? They try to replace us. Are they going to be helpful? They're living above. We're living below. This could really work out to be something, and I almost want to write it because there's so much there. But the movie we're given is poorly directed, poorly acted. The story doesn't flow right. We get these things in bits and pieces. When you got Ben Kingsley makes an appearance, classic actor, and he always does a great job of acting. But the character he's giving us and the little bit of lines, it's like he tells us nothing. He ends up with all of his background, and there's several of these figures that appear, adds nothing to the story, that remains just as dumb, vapid, vacuous, uninteresting, boring, and ridiculously protracted. And by the end, you're just like, is this over? Please, is this over? But there's so much there. They clearly intended to make something epic. Somehow or another, it does not materialize. But hey, it's out there. It's free. You should find it, watch it. If you haven't been forced yourself to sit through it, it's interesting. And let me know what you think.